Imagine a course about justice that begins not in a lecture hall, but in the backseat of a luxury sedan idling in a rain-slicked alley. Suppose you are Han Tae-woo, a man whose life is governed by two sovereign masters, power and profit. Your organization is a trolley car hurtling down the track at 60 miles an hour, and its brakes don't work because, in your world, mercy is a mechanical failure. At the end of that track are the debtors, the people of this city who have fallen behind on their payments. You know for sure that if you crash into them, their lives will be destroyed. Usually, the choice is simple. You follow the consequentialist moral reasoning that has kept you at the top of the food chain. It is better for one family to suffer so that the rest of the city remains in awe of your discipline. It is a matter of maximizing the utility of fear to maintain order. You sit behind tinted glass, an onlooker who is also the driver, watching your broad-shouldered enforcers corner a woman who has run out of time. But then, the story changes. Off to the right, a sidetrack appears in the form of a child. Seo Rin steps into the path of the enforcers. She is small, her light-colored t-shirt is stained with the dust of the street, and her shoes are scuffed from a life of running. She doesn't have a weapon, but she has a defiant expression and one tiny, clenched fist. She is the one person who shouldn't be there, the innocent obstacle that makes you hesitate to pull the lever. Suddenly, the active choice of your men feels different. If you allow them to push her aside, you are participating in an act of conscious thought that leads to the destruction of innocence. You feel a built-in pressure to bring your judgments about this particular case into alignment with the principles of your business. Is it right to sacrifice this one child's safety for the sake of the utility and reputation of your empire? This is the moral lever. Your steering wheel still works, you can turn the trolley car if you want to. You can choose to maintain the status quo, or you can step into the restless reason that philosophy demands. The question isn't just about what you will do to her, but what the story will say about you. As the enforcer raises his hand to move her, you have a split-second choice. What is the right thing to do? What would you do? To understand the man sitting in the back of the black Mercedes, one must first understand the philosophy that built the car. For Han Tae-woo, life is not a series of random accidents, but a calculated system of moral and financial accounting. He operates under the belief that all human beings are governed by two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. He has spent decades mastering the art of distributing both to ensure that his world remains in a state of perfect, profitable equilibrium. To Tae-woo, the right thing to do, the just thing to do, is always to maximize the overall utility of his empire. In this course, he has spent his life teaching the city, morality is located purely in the consequences of an act. If a rival must be removed to prevent a gang war that would kill dozens, then the removal is not a murder, it is of consequentialist necessity to save the many. He views himself less as a criminal and more as a cold, efficient legislator of the shadows, ensuring the greatest good for the greatest number of his own people. He has lived in a dwelling place of permanent settlement, where his assumptions about power are never questioned and his methods are never strange. His enforcers, the tall men in dark jackets, are merely the steering wheel of his trolley car. They move with a handful of people who understand that the world is a place of tragic circumstances where sometimes one must be sacrificed to spare the five. For Tae-woo, the debt of honor is the most basic principle of his utilitarian theory. Every favor granted is a pleasure recorded, and every betrayal is a pain that must be balanced. He has honed his political judgment to be a distancing, even debilitating activity, allowing him to watch a family's ruin with the clinical detachment of a doctor looking after a patient. He has long acquiesced in a form of skepticism, believing that there is no absolute right or wrong, only the results that flow from the operation of his procedures. He believes he knows the story of his city by heart, and he knows exactly where it leads. He is a man who has traded self-knowledge for the accomplishments of active life, following the models of those who have a good livelihood and a reputation for ruthlessness. But as his car idles in the alley, the restless reason he has suppressed for years is about to be awakened. He is about to learn that some debts cannot be paid in cash, and some principles are more categorical than profit. A sadder story of disaster in the shadows of the city was never told than that of the woman now cornered in the alley. Before she became a debtor in Han Tae-woo's ledger, she was known to be a person of excellent character, a mother whose only crime was the hopefulness of youthful ambition. She had once managed a small shop, a modest vessel for her dreams, until the economic tides turned and her ship foundered in a sea of rising costs and medical bills. Like the survivors of a shipwreck, she found herself in a situation so desperate that she had to do what she had to do to survive. For months, she and Rin had subsisted on the equivalent of 2 cans of preserved turnips, metaphorically speaking, stretching every cent while the world around them offered no fresh water or relief. She had not sought out the Han Syndicate out of malice or greed, but out of a tragic circumstance, a necessity that she believed might exonerate her from the usual rules of the street. She had borrowed to keep a roof over their heads, thinking the journey would eventually make a way for them, but instead, it led her to this 19th day of desperation. In Taewoo's eyes, her background was a secondary detail, yet the facts of her case were not in dispute. She was the one severely injured victim in a social wreck, and he was the surgeon deciding whether to yank out her remaining stability to save the reputation of his 5-man crew. This was the dire circumstance that had brought her to her knees, a choice between the categorical requirement to pay one's debts and the fundamental right to exist. As she looked up at the enforcers, she didn't see businessmen, she saw the embodiment of a moral logic that insisted it was better that one should suffer so that the order of the many could survive. She stood there, not as a criminal, but as a person who had run out of time, waiting to see if the man in the luxury car would view her life as a consequence to be managed or a soul to be spared. Seo Rin did not understand the intricate debate between consequentialist and categorical moral reasoning, but she lived the reality of their collision every day. Her world was not shaped by the famous books of Aristotle or John Locke, but by the tangible friction of the pavement against her scuffed shoes. Those shoes, worn thin by miles of walking to avoid bus fares, were a testament to her youthful ambition, a fierce, quiet resolve to be the man of the house, much like the cabin boy Richard Parker who set out to sea to prove his worth. While other children her age played with the pretty toys, Rin had already abandoned the innocence of childhood to learn the accomplishments of active life. Her daily life was an exercise in self-knowledge, an unsettling realization that her family was the one often sacrificed for the sake of the 5. She spent her afternoons not in a classroom, but in the narrow corridors of their cramped apartment, calculating the utility of every bowl of rice and every hour of candlelight. She had seen her mother hide bruises with the same staggering euphemism that a captain might use to describe a gruesome necessity in his diary. She watched the way her mother's hands shook when the rent was due, a restlessness of reason that no amount of skepticism could soothe. Despite her size, Rin possessed a sense of duty that defied the logic of the streets. She did not see herself as a helpless bystander on a bridge, watching a trolley car careen toward those she loved. She saw herself as the only brake that still worked. In her mind, there was no lottery, no fair procedure that could justify the sacrifice of her mother's dignity. Her ambition was not for wealth or reputation, but for a world where the intrinsic quality of an act of love outweighed the cold math of a debt collector's ledger. On this day, as she stood in the alley, her scuffed shoes were planted firmly on the track. She was no longer just an onlooker, she was a participant in a story that was, at its core, about her. The silence of the alley was shattered not by a scream, but by the heavy, rhythmic thud of boots, the sound of a trolley car that had finally jumped its track and was now hurtling toward its destination at 60 miles an hour. The enforcers had arrived, 2 tall men of broad build whose very presence was a categorical requirement of the Mafia's business model. They moved with a clinical detachment, their dark jackets like a uniform of necessity, as if they were merely instruments of a larger, unavoidable force. To them, the mother was not a person with a story, but a variable in an equation of debt that needed to be resolved to maximize the utility of the syndicate's reputation. They cornered her against the damp brick wall, and for a moment, the world felt desperate because there were no brakes that could stop what was about to happen. The mother felt that helplessness, that semi-stupor of the victim who knows the 19th day of their endurance has finally passed. In the logic of the street, this was the moment where the one is sacrificed so that the 5, the organization's other debtors, will learn the price of failure. The enforcers didn't need to speak, their stance was a staggering euphemism for the violence that was the standard procedure for those who fell behind. From the back of the luxury sedan, Taewoo watched the scene unfold like a doctor observing a patient in an emergency room. He noticed the intrinsic quality of the fear radiating from the woman, yet his internal moral reasoning remained strictly consequentialist. He saw her as a severely injured victim, in a wreck he had engineered, and he was prepared to let the estate of the world result in her ruin for the sake of the larger welfare of his empire. The enforcers were ready to yank out her security, believing that murder, or its structural equivalent, was simply what one had to do to survive in their world. But the trolley was about to hit something it didn't expect. As the lead enforcer reached out to seize the mother, the child stepped into the narrow gap between the power of the syndicate and the vulnerability of the parent. Rin didn't just stand there, she became the sidetrack that forced the driver to notice the steering wheel. She was a handful of a girl against the vast majority of Taewoo's power, but her presence was a categorical duty that no amount of cold calculation could easily dismiss. The enforcers hesitated, their active choice momentarily frozen by the sight of a child who refused to be an onlooker. The momentum was still there, the threat was still hurtling, but for the first time, the right thing to do was no longer a simple matter of addition and subtraction. Seo Rin stood her ground, her small frame becoming a human shield against a trolley car of inevitable violence. As the enforcers loomed over her mother, the child's presence forced a split-second choice upon men who were used to acting without hesitation. The lead enforcer paused, his hand suspended in midair. For him, this was no longer a routine collection, but an active choice, to involve a person who otherwise would not have been part of the situation. This wasn't the same type of mentality that justifies collateral damage for the sake of a larger goal, it was a confrontation with the intrinsic quality of an innocent child's defiance. The enforcers felt the built-in pressure to align their actions with the cold principles of the Han Syndicate, yet they hesitated. To push past Rin was not merely a consequence of their job, but a conscious thought to harm a vulnerable child. They looked back toward the luxury car, searching for a way out of this moral deadlock, realizing that better that one should die so that 5 should live. It didn't feel right when the one was a 7-year-old with a clenched fist. The girl's posture was a categorical statement of rights that transcended the utility of the debt. Watching from the shadows, Taewoo saw his men falter. He recognized the risks of this moment, not just the political risk of losing face, but the personal risk of self-knowledge. He saw that Rin was not merely an onlooker on a bridge, she had made herself the sidetrack, and her youthful ambition to protect her mother had effectively wrecked the philosophical point of his cold business logic. The enforcer's hesitation suggested that even among his most loyal men, there was a limit to what they could justify as a tragic circumstance. Rin did not move. She stared into the tinted glass of the Mercedes, her gaze making the familiar strange and unsettling the man inside. She was the restless reason that Taewoo had tried to ignore, a categorical moral requirement, standing in the middle of a dark alley. The enforcers stood helpless in the face of her bravery, waiting for a signal. The right thing to do was no longer a poll or a hypothetical, it was a decision that would determine whether Taewoo remained a doctor of the underworld or something more human. Behind the tinted glass of the Mercedes, Han Taewoo sat in what Immanuel Kant might have called a resting place for human reason, a space where he could reflect upon his dogmatic wanderings without yet having to act. From this vantage point, he was the quintessential onlooker, standing on a bridge overlooking a track where a tragedy was about to careen into the innocent. He watched Rin, the small girl with the serious, defiant expression, and for the first time in years, he didn't see a debtor's child or a variable in a ledger, he saw the intrinsic quality of the act itself. Usually, Taewoo viewed the world through the cold lens of consequentialist moral reasoning, locating morality in the results and the state of the world that followed his commands. In that framework, the right thing to do was simply to maximize the utility of fear to ensure his empire's stability. If his men pushed the girl, the result would be the preservation of his reputation, the greatest good for his syndicate. But as he observed the child's tense posture and clenched fist, he felt a built-in pressure to re-examine those principles. The girl wasn't calculating the balance of pleasure over pain or the wider effects on her family's welfare. She was acting on a categorical duty, an absolute moral requirement to protect her mother regardless of the consequences. As he watched her, Taewoo felt the unsettlement that comes when philosophy confronts us with what we already know but have chosen to forget. The familiar, unquestioned setting of a debt collection was suddenly made strange. He realized in that moment that self-knowledge is like lost innocence, once he recognized that a categorically truth in Rin's eyes, it could never be unthought or unknown. He could no longer simply acquiesce in skepticism or throw up his hands and say that morality was just a matter of personal principle. The story unfolding in the rain-slicked alley was no longer just about a debt, it was a story about him. To remain a silent onlooker was a distancing, even debilitating activity that he could no longer sustain. The restlessness of his own reason had been awakened, and he realized he had to see where it might lead. The sound of the heavy car door latching open was a sharp, clinical click, the sound of a steering wheel finally being turned toward the side track. As Han Tae-woo stepped out of the luxury sedan, the rain-slicked pavement of the alley didn't just reflect the neon lights of the city, it reflected a man who was finally transitioning from an onlooker to a participant. He stood tall, his silhouette defined by a custom-tailored coat that blended the sharp lines of a traditional suit with the edgy defiance of streetwear couture. He moved with the calculated grace of a striker on a pitch, his eyes fixed on the goal, with the same intensity a fan might reserve for a final minute in Manchester. His lead enforcer, a man whose broad build usually served as the unstoppable momentum of the syndicate's trolley, froze. The enforcer's hand remained suspended near the child, caught in the built-in pressure to align his actions with the boss's usual utilitarian logic. For years, the command had been simple: maximize the balance of pleasure over pain for the organization, even if it meant sacrificing the one for the many. But as Tae-woo approached, the air in the alley shifted. He was no longer looking for the greatest good for the greatest number, he was looking at the intrinsic quality of the act. "Stand down," Tae-woo commanded, his voice a low, steady vibration that carried more authority than a courtroom verdict. The lead enforcer hesitated, his mind likely drifting toward the consequentialist moral reasoning that had governed their lives, the debt, the reputation, the message to the city. "But boss," he started, "the ledger, the business requires an answer." Tae-woo didn't look at the ledger. He looked at Seo Rin, whose scuffed shoes remained planted firmly in the dirt, her small fist a categorical duty in the face of absolute ruin. He realized that to push her aside would be an act of murder on his part, a conscious action that no amount of profit could justify. The distancing activity of his luxury car was gone, he was standing in the emergency room of his own morality, and he chose to look after the one severely injured soul rather than the 5 interests of his empire. "The debt is finished," Tae-woo said, his eyes meeting the child's. "There is a different kind of justice at work here today." In that moment, the Mafia verdict was not one of violence, but of a profound, unsettling transformation. He had stepped away from the skepticism of the streets, the idea that everyone has their own principles and nothing more can be said, and embraced a categorical requirement that transcended the bottom line. He knew that by sparing this family, he was making his familiar world strange, and that it would never be quite the same again. As he motioned for his men to return to the car, Tae-woo felt the restlessness of reason awakening within him, a story that was no longer about a collection, but about the man he was becoming. The story of the alley began to spread through the city like a runaway trolley car, impossible to unthink or unknown once it had been told. In the smoke-filled clubs and the high-rise offices associated with the DKD global empire, the news was described with a staggering euphemism, a reconciliation of accounts. But to those who lived in the narrow corridors of the street, it was a sadder story, or perhaps a more hopeful one, of a disaster averted at the very last moment. The city's underworld functioned like a jury, and the majority were not just swayed by the news, they were deeply unsettled. Everyone knew the principle that had governed the Han syndicate for decades: better that one family should suffer so that the many remain in line. To forgive a debt out of a final murmur of consent, or a child's bravery was, to many, an act that wrecked the philosophical point of their entire enterprise. It was an act that made the familiar world of power and profit strange, inviting a new way of seeing that most were not prepared to accept. Critics and rivals within the city began to whisper that Han Tae-woo had pursued his new perspective further than he should, risking absolute ruin. They argued that he had abandoned the accomplishments of active life, the reputation and blessings of a man of excellent character, for a petty quibble over a girl's scuffed shoes. The Mafia verdict, from the skeptics on the corner, was that he had become a worse citizen of his own world, a man who had allowed the restlessness of reason to debilitate his authority. They claimed that a debt is a debt, just as murder is murder, and that to treat it otherwise was to give up on the moral reflection of their reality. Yet, the very fact that this act of mercy persisted in every conversation suggested it was unavoidable. It served as an exercise in self-knowledge for the entire city, taking what everyone knew from familiar, unquestioned settings and making it seem entirely new. Taewoo had not just spared a child, he had gestured toward reasons having to do with the intrinsic quality of an act, regardless of the consequences for his bottom line. He had awakened a restlessness in the city's conscience that no amount of skepticism could settle, proving that though these questions are impossible to resolve once and for all, they are inescapable because we live some answer to them every day. As the story reached the furthest corners of his territory, the city realized that the story was no longer just about a debt, it was about the risks of a man who chose to see a new way of being just. As Han Tae-woo sat alone in the silence following the alleyway encounter, he realized that he had reached a point of no return, the familiar, unquestioned settings of his life as a predator had been made strange. He had entered into an exercise in self-knowledge, and like a lost innocence, once the familiar turns strange, it can never be unthought or unknown. By choosing to spare the child and her mother, he had not merely made a tactical error, he had invited a new way of seeing that made his old life impossible. He understood now that philosophy is a distancing, even debilitating activity that had made him a worse citizen of his own criminal world before it could ever make him a better one. The political risks were already mounting, as his subordinates whispered of his absolute ruin for indulging in such moral quibbles. They, like Calicles in the Gorgias, would have advised him to abandon these arguments and return to the accomplishments of active life, to the livelihood and reputation that came from a cold, unwavering heart. But Tae-woo could no longer find a dwelling place for permanent settlement in the skepticism that had once protected him. He could no longer simply throw up his hands and claim that every man has his own principles and there is nothing more to be said about it. The evasion of skepticism was no longer a solution because he was forced to live the answer to these moral questions every single day. He realized that the stories of the trolley cars, the doctors, and the cabin boys were not just abstract hypotheticals, they were a mirror. This enterprise was riveting precisely because it was a story he was currently writing, and he finally understood that the story was about him. He had moved beyond the resting place of easy, consequentialist calculations and into the restless reason that Immanuel Kant described so well. He was no longer a man who merely reacted to the world to maximize his own utility, he was a man who had been awakened to the categorical requirements of justice. The city might view his mercy as a weakness, but for Tae-woo, it was a necessary awakening of the restlessness of reason. He knew that the days and weeks to come would bring new controversies and conflicts that would further test his moral grounding. He was prepared to debate the equality and inequality of his own city, no longer just to enliven abstract books, but to bring out what was truly at stake in his everyday life. Though he did not know where this story would lead, he was no longer willing to acquiesce in the silence of his luxury car. He had pulled the lever, and the restlessness of his reason was now his only guide.